So now let me introduce our speakers. We have Deena Newaz, her pronouns are she, her, and Spencer Bridgman, he, him. And before I hand it over to our speakers, I'll just explain quickly how the meeting will work. So the speakers will go for a total of 30 minutes. Then we will have some time for questions and comments from the audience. And then the speakers will respond to all of the questions and comments at the end in their concluding remarks. If you'd like to speak, you can raise your hand and I'll add you to the speakers list. And I'll go over this again when we get back. So questions or comments are welcome, but please try to keep your contributions to 3 minutes. This will allow for more contributions to the, for more contributions throughout the discussion. Finally, we encourage you to post to social media throughout the conference to share your thoughts and experiences. Please use the hashtag #RedOctober 2025, and you can tag Spring on all platforms using @SpringMag.ca. Okay, now over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Bridget, and thank you everyone for being here. And I just want to acknowledge, I know this is an economics talk, so you're all really brave for being here as we go through some charts and equations. But before that, I guess, jokes aside, I promise this won't be a snooze fest, but this talk is a part of a series of talks today under Understanding Capitalism that shows that Marxist and socialist economic theory, which is not the stuff you learn in school often, and even if you learn it in a perverse way, because we live in such a propagandized world that has made it absolutely okay that it's okay for Apple and Amazon and Tesla to make all this money, but you surely are struggling to pay rent, and that's absolutely okay. That's actually normal, and maybe one day in 400 years, you can maybe actually own a house. So this is the kind of perverse reality that we live under constantly. It's barbaric, and we're hoping that through the series of talks in this session today, we started with understanding what is exploitation and where profit comes from, to this particular talk that economic theory, Marxist economics in particular, is not for experts and bankers. It's for all of us to engage with, to benefit from, because understanding our economy today and why we are constantly in crisis, from one crisis to another, like being on a hamster wheel. And it helps us understand why 5 companies run our economy and why everything we love shuts down constantly, like the Imperial Pub. Why is everything being replaced with luxury condos? Why everything becomes big grocery store chains, and why we can't seem to afford anything. And again, and I want to emphasize this as we get into this talk today, is that we don't have to be experts to know what it feels like to live under crisis. We don't need to know how the market operates to know that we live in a world where human activity takes a life of its own and it dominates us, our bosses dominate us, wherever we look, it's someone's doing the dominating, and it feels like a world full of endless work, endless unemployment, overproduction, and starvation. And this is particularly, I think, an important time to be talking about economics, because we are having one of the biggest unemployment crises in this country, and it's not just in this country. If you're paying attention, you would know that some parts of Ontario have double-digit unemployment rates. We haven't seen unemployment rates like this since the 90s. And it's particularly worse for young folks who are seeing unemployment rates close to, I think, 17%. And that's wild in the middle of sort of massive layoffs happening everywhere we look, from Scotiabank to the public sector to the Stellantis factories. So the reason that we wanted to emphasize or talk about the tendency of rate of profit to fall is to show that exploitation, which is, if you were in the previous talk, it is essentially a few people getting hold of value. Value is basically labor that we all produce in this room. And that sort of stealing or getting hold of our value is often hidden from plain sight through various mechanisms which we'll be talking about today. And what ends up happening is that it makes us compete for scraps, and it tells us that the only way we get ahead is by competing for whatever is left for us to fight amongst ourselves, which divides workers, which divides the working class, which is why we see sort of folks blaming immigrants and international students, and why many other immigrants like myself blame other immigrants for it, because we are constantly looking for why do things suck so much for us, and we are constantly looking for who to blame, and hopefully we have a better sense of who to blame after this. So a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. It'll dive a bit deeper into making sense of the recurring economic crisis that we are constantly under from 2008 to the 70s to post-war to what's happening right now in our economy as well. And the goal is not to stop at understanding the tendencies. It's not to stop at understanding how the graphs work, what the equations are, why are things happening. The whole point of this is to do something about it. Because there's no point of understanding something if we don't know what we can do about it. And it's also seeing the barbaric nature of our economic systems and the kind of strategic actions we can take to transform society. So there are 4 parts to this talk very simply. The first one is why are we talking about this particular tendency, which is a tendency of rate of profit to fall in our economy. And then Spencer will talk us through what is the tendency of rate of profit to fall. We'll also be talking about some counter arguments. Again, this has been around for over 100 years. There have been many folks who've engaged with it, many well-known economists who have looked at who've tried to prove and shown how this tendency plays out. And I'll also talk about some counterfactuals as well. And then finally, and most importantly, we'll end by talking about how does this relate to our present moment? Why does this matter at all? Why are we here on a Saturday morning talking about this through some examples? And again, we are not experts because that's not our politics. Our politics isn't to be experts telling people what to do. We are all capable of doing the leading, understanding all of this and cutting through the propaganda to organize for a world in our own image. So yeah, if you need recommendations, if you hate this, come talk to us after. That's absolutely fine. All right, so why talk about something that seems quite complex? What's the point of engaging with the tendency of rate of profit to fall? And very simply, for me at least, it's to develop a real political strategy. We need to understand the specific situation of capitalism and also what sort of periods it has come through. Historically, what have we gone through? Where are we headed? And that's why the issue of profit rates and what they really reveal about our deeper sort of system is so important, because we live in a system that is governed by profit. We can talk about it in various ways, but that's essentially what drives our current economy. And very simply, the tendency of rate of profit to fall rests on the idea, if there's one thing you want to take away, that at least I've tried to take away, is that the source of all value, all the things that makes these engines in our world run, is basically labor, right? It's the work that we are doing. Machines, they are also made by people. Machines don't sort of fall from the sky. People make it through tireless, underpaid work. AI, again, built by people. It's not like it is amorphous being. So tendency of rate of profit rests on the idea that people create value, but when capitalists, these are the people who own the labor, they own the machines, they own the property, whatever you want to call it, and if they start investing more in sort of any other things but labor, then the source of profit, which is labor, if that declines, profit declines as well. Now again, it might feel like a shoddy explanation, but Spencer will walk us through it, so don't worry if that didn't make any sense. But the 3 main things to keep in mind in this session is that capitalist crisis is all about exploitation, which is maximizing profit at all cost. It's about the motive of profit, and then finally competition. If there's 3 things you want to we come back to in this talk, it's those 3 ingredients of recurring crisis. And finally, the other goal of this talk is to restate the foundations of Marxist economics. And again, it's not like a special group of economists. Like so many mainstream economists talk about these things in various ways. It's not like a secret we're unveiling for you. But it's also to rescue these kinds of conversations that are happening now all the time. From like Thomas Piketty talking about exactly this stuff like a few months ago, to rescue it from debates of academic obscurity. That's the problem, right? Like all of these debates, like some people have the time to do it, the rest of us are trying to get by. And that's how the system sometimes carries on, and hopefully we can cut through that. And finally, we are talking about tendency of rate of profit because it helps us understand the most recent crash, hopefully many of us can remember, which is 2008-2009 crisis. And there were very superficial explanations, very simple explanation of what really happened in the mainstream sort of media and sort of analysis, which is that the fault is simply with an unleashed financial sector or a few greedy bankers who made the entire economy crash. But the goal is not but what this tendency helps us understand is that it's not a few greedy bankers or a few bad apples, but it is the dynamic of capitalism itself, the competition, the endless accumulation of profit for its own sake, is the source of this crisis. And we'll do a deep analysis of 2008 and what really happened there as well. And then the final point, before I hand it over, is that at the end of the day, none of this is hard science. None of this is set in stone. That's true of all economic theory. Whether this tendency or anything else you've ever come across, it's not an unfalsifiable truth about the system. It is a tendency in a dynamic system with lots of other countervailing tendencies as well. All of this is dynamic and it's constantly moving and constantly changing. And the goal is not to be fixated on the axes or the graph or the theory itself, but how we use this kind of framing, this kind of language, this kind of understanding to inform our movements, to talk to workers in a simple, accessible way, and to eventually end the exploitation of workers just for the sake of profit and end a system that does not meet human needs. And finally, the part that gives me radical hope is that as we dug deeper into this tendency is that the role of workers and the working class, which is constantly, we are told that we need to be replaced by robots and machines and AI, is ever more important. If we want the kind of economy we want, the kind of world we want to live in, workers play a center role. And that's a liberatory way of thinking about economy, is that if we run it, we must be center stage, and it cannot be all these gimmicks and speculation. So I'll stop there. I'll pass it to Spencer to do a much better job of explaining in detail what is the tendency of rate of profit to fall.
Thanks, Deena. So yeah, to explain why Marx thinks there's a tendency for the rate of profit to fall, we first have to explain what he means by the rate of profit. And this is the very boring part of the talk, but we need to get through it. So yeah, this is the basic kind of equation that Marx and other economists use for the rate of profit. So to use his technical terms first, it's simply surplus value divided by capital, which includes constant capital and variable capital. But let's break those terms down into plain language. What does that actually mean? So yeah, we have three things in this calculation. The first is surplus value. And this is a crucial concept. If folks were in Fez and Emily's talk this morning, they would have learned about this already. But yeah, the concept of surplus value is really the base for profit, and once you wrap your head around that, a lot of these more complex parts of the theory make a lot more sense. So essentially, surplus value is the profit that the capitalist can extract from their workers. To be more exact, it's the value produced by the worker above and beyond the amount they're paid in their hourly wages. And I think an example is probably the best way to illustrate this, which goes on the left side of the slide there. So let's say we have a worker in a cowboy hat factory who can produce 20 hats in a day, and each hat is sold for $10. So the value that worker creates through the production of those hats is $200, right? 20 times 10. But let's say the worker is only paid $100 for their work. So the worker produces value for the capitalist equal to their wages in the first half of the day. So that's, you can't see it very well, but yeah, that's the first half of the day, their wages, the red bar there. And then for the remaining half of the day, they're producing surplus value. So this is new value created, and it's the source of profit for the capitalist. So that's the green part of the bar there. So maybe if they work an 8-hour day, that's the first 4 hours, they're creating value that's equal to their wages, and the next 4 hours, they're creating surplus for the capitalist. Okay, so that's the first term in that equation for rate of profit. The second and third are to do with capital. So yeah, first we've got constant capital. So these are the cowboy hat capitalists' costs on the factory, machinery, raw materials, etc. Some Marxists, like Chris Harman, call this the capital's quote-unquote investment cost. So these are the non-living, non-human costs of the production process. So the leather for the hat, the fabric cutting machine, the building, etc. And as Deena mentioned, each of these things is, of course, the product of human labor in a previous production process, but through the act of the capitalist purchasing them, the cowboy hat capitalist for this example, they become what Marx calls quote-unquote dead labor for this process. And yeah, these are dead labor because their surplus value has already been realized through their previous sale. So consequently, no new surplus value can be created by this constant capital. New value can only be created by living labor, right? And this is the third thing in the equation, variable capital. This is the cost for the capitalists to pay their workers, essentially. So this is the living human labor cost in the production process. So returning to the formula again, we've got surplus value, i.e. the profit that the capitalists can extract from the labor time of their workers, divided by the capitalist costs in the form of constant capital, i.e. machinery, raw materials, etc., and variable capital, i.e. workers' wages for labor time. And so here I think it's important to distinguish between the rate of profit and the mass of profit. So like, why are we talking about the rate of profit? Why aren't we just talking about like absolute profits that the capitalists are making? The rate of profit, as we've seen, is essentially concerned with the capitalist profit compared to its costs. For instance, are the capitalist costs, or is the capitalist on average making 20% more profit than their costs, or 10%, or 200, etc. It's like that percent, that rate. This is similar to when mainstream economists talk about the rate of return or return on investment, etc. These are things that we hear a lot in like more mainstream economics. And it's not the same thing as the massive profit. So the massive profit, as I said before, is the absolute amount of profit that's generated. So it's not a rate, it would be like, 100 million or a trillion or a billion, whatever. It's a number. So you can have a situation, which is kind of counterintuitive, but you can have a situation where there's a falling rate of profit, but a rising mass of profit. So for instance, I've got this example up here. Let's say last year I made $5 trillion in profit, and it cost me $1 trillion. So it's a very good year for me in like the cowboy hat business, I guess. Let's say that was last year. And then this year I made $10 trillion and it cost me $4 trillion. So in this example, my massive profit doubled from 5 trillion to 10 trillion, but my rate of profit fell from 500% to 250 because I spent 4 times as much to make twice as much. So as a capitalist, like these are still good profits, I wouldn't be panicking, but I would be concerned because this means that my investment is becoming less efficient. And this is something that capitalists care very deeply about, and it's why they care deeply about the rate of profit. So the efficiency of their investment equals their competitiveness, right? Deena mentioned the importance of competition in like the capitalist dynamics. It's extremely important for the capitalists to be competitive in order to survive. Because if they're not competitive, then they get squeezed out of the market by their rival competitive or capitalists. So this is why Marx focused on the rate of profit, because it's actually a better indicator of the health of the capitalist economy versus the massive profit. In times of crisis, we often see the rate of profit fall first, and then it's followed by a fall in the massive profit. Okay, so that's why we focus on the rate of profit. But why does Marx think there is a tendency for the rate of profit to fall under capitalism? This is the key question. So it's because competition pushes capitalists to spend more and more on constant capital, in particular machinery, in proportion to what they spend on labor. So they spend more on like the fancy robots to make their products while slashing their workforce. And this can be good for the first individual capitalists looking to undercut their competition. For instance, the first capitalist who buys a fancy cowboy hat making machine and lays off 90% of their workforce, they're able to lower their hat price and grab more market share. But when all of the other capitalists copy them and also buy fancy robots, it's bad for the profits of the overall system, right? And this is the key. And this is because labor is the root source of surplus value and thus profit. So more fancy robots means increasing constant capital costs while decreasing surplus value and consequently profit. So going back to the graph, the denominator gets bigger while the numerator gets smaller. And this may seem counterintuitive at first, like, doesn't automation usually raise profits? But again, it's important to remember that Marx is concerned not with the rate of profit for the individual capitalist, but with the capitalist system as a whole. So as the production system as a whole relies more and more on automation and robots, et cetera, and less on human labor, then the costs go up, but the surplus value created by workers stays the same or decreases. So to put it simply, more robots means higher costs and usually less workers, which means lower profit rate. So that's essentially where the tendency comes from. And this might all sound interesting and plausible as a theory, but what's the proof, right? We've got hundreds of years of capitalism under our belt. Is this actually happening? And I think here it's important to emphasize, as Deena said before, that the falling rate of profit is a tendency over time. So it's not something that's always observable in every moment. And here I think an analogy to climate change is helpful. So you can't look at a single day of weather and determine if the climate is worsening. You have to look at long-term trends and patterns. So climate change is the trend of temperatures increasing and the pattern of extreme weather events becoming more often and more extreme. Similarly, you can't look at one company or one industry or 1 year and determine if the average rate of profit is falling. You have to look at the rate of profit over decades and centuries across the whole system. And when we look at this, we do see a general trend of the rate of profit to decrease. So although there are periods of time where the rate of profit rises, the general trend is downwards. And Marxist economists like Anwar Sheikh and Guglielmo Carcetti and Michael Roberts have put together an extensive body of data supporting this, as well as more mainstream economists like Deena mentioned, Thomas Piketty, and even someone like Larry Summers. Like, these economists are definitely not Marxist, they don't use Marxist terms, but they've identified a similar downward trend in the system's profitability. Got a little graph there from Michael Roberts, which kind of shows this. So the tendency for the rate of profit to fall is the pressure that topples capitalism over and over again into crisis. And we don't have to just rely on theory and data here. We've seen this in our own lifetimes, as Deena mentioned, as we'll repeat again in this talk. We've got lots of personal experience of this, right? Like, looking at the last 20, 25 years, there was the dot-com crash in 2001, then of course the Great Recession in 2008, and then more recently, the COVID-19 recession in 2020. Economic crises keep getting worse, and so does our ability to recover from them, and that's because there's a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. So that's a brief overview of the tendency, and now I'll hand it back to Deena.
Thank you, Spencer. A round of applause because it's hard to do. No, stuff like that. Okay. It's hard to do, and again, I think the key thing to take is just we wanted to go through sort of some examples, and I think the key thing there is over a period of time. We're not talking about your mom and pop shop. That's sort of good. It's like sort of what is the tendency under the capitalist system of constant accumulation, and if the goal is profit, there is a downward pressure on profit because everyone's competing to make more profit, and over time, and to me intuitively, yes, that makes sense. If all people are always competing, then you're always investing in new things to keep up with sort of the rate of competition and to outdo your competitor. So what it does sound like from what we've been studying and from Spencer's explanation is that not only is there no peace for workers under the systems, there's no peace for capitalists too, because they are constantly having to like, shit, now I need to get something else because the guy down the road or the guy or those people over in China, in Belgium are doing something better than me, so I gotta get in on that. So there is no peace for anyone in this system, is at least what screams out to me. But there are some countervailing influences that sustain sort of periods of boom. Like if you see on the graph behind me, you'll see in certain parts throughout in the last, 100 years or so, little under 100? Yeah, 150 years, there have been periods of sustained increased rates of profit. And in those periods, there are certain countervailing tendencies, things that help capitalists recover their rates of profit. So one question that I often get when I talk about this is that, well, if the system is so prone to crisis and the rates of profit are constantly in decline over a long period of time, why haven't we seen the end of capitalism? Why are we still here doing this shit over and over again? It's because the crisis is not the end. These kinds of capitalist crises, these dips that you're seeing in the graph, they are not the end of the system because it can and has always created opportunities for some capitalists. And I think that's important. While some fail, while some capitalists get pushed out of the business because they just can't keep up, or they have invested too much and they do not have enough profits and they have to fold, it drives some capitalists out of business, but that can permit the recovery of profit for some others. And what I'm essentially talking about is the concentration of capital, essentially the pathway to creating monopolies, right? So during periods of crisis, there is almost like cannibalism that happens in periods of slump, where some companies eat up other companies and become bigger companies. And we know what that looks and feels like because we live under these circumstances. And these kinds of economic crises creates panic within the ruling classes or the capitalist classes and the big corporations. But most importantly, like I said, I don't care how like Jeff Bezos feels on a daily basis. But what it does mean is misery for the mass of people and the workers who see layoffs, who see their homes being taken away from them. And that's why we talk about this. Because again, I'm not concerned with what happens to the ruling class, but I am concerned with what happens to everyone else. And but at the same time, the perverse nature of this system is that it gives advantages to those individual capitalists who can avoid going bust during these periods. And there's always companies that can manage to avoid it. Some of them buy up assets of other capitalists on the cheap. We've seen this in the UK as well, when sort of there's a crash in sort of the utility sector, some company gobble up other companies and become bigger companies. We can see this happen with sort of a number of stores in the UK were shutting down because they just couldn't compete, like department stores like Debenhams. I don't know if you've heard of them. Anyway, if not, you don't need to. But essentially, stores were shutting down, and then you have an investor from the UAE come and buy it for $1. And what this leads to is also high levels of unemployment. And capitalist firms survive the slump by doing these things over and over. And it's what Marx called the process of concentration and centralization of capital. So it's essentially monopolies. So what's the proof of this? Well, in the 1980s, this was in the previous slide, but essentially after there was a series of slumps and sort of hikes in the market, 500 biggest transnational corporations controlled 2/3 of world trade. And this is in the 1980s. So the 15 biggest companies at the time, like General Motors, ExxonMobil, IBM, their combined income was greater than that of 120 countries. But right now, in 2025, now the top 30 companies have market shares higher than advanced economies. With a market cap of more than $2.1 trillion, for instance, Apple's market capitalization today is larger than that of 96% of the country's GDPs in the world. And that's bonkers when you think about it. Apple's market share is greater than 96% of the country's GDP in the world. And that's sort of these symptoms of sort of concentration of capital. And the current trade war that we are currently under, we are seeing thousands of layoffs. Just a few weeks ago, they are shutting down a sort of automotive, like a plant a motor plant in Ontario, leading to 3,000 jobs being lost. And this trade war is an example of the turbulence of this kind of monopoly capitalism that breeds where different massive multinationals look to increase their profits and try to expand their markets at the expense of their rivals. And then the state intervenes to try to counterbalance that, sort of creeping into other markets to maximize profit. That's why we saw Trump with his billboard of tariffs that he was trying to announce. So the economic compulsion of competition forces all monopolies to continually invest in new technologies, because that's the logic of capitalism, is that new technologies and even greater production capacity will help them sort of outcompete their rivals, now not just within their own borders, but those in other parts of the world as well. And the result of this is sort of high levels of overproduction on a global scale, a global glut of goods being saturated and thrown into markets. And in these cases, there are some countervailing tendencies, because we have capitalist states. We have states looking on and they're like, shit, our big banks and our big companies are folding. What can we do? And that's a tendency that sort of helps protect the system and is a countervailing tendency to the tendency of rate of profit to fall, which is state capitalism. And essentially what that is a tendency to look at, it's basically our ability to look at economic recoveries as periods in which sort of the state and actual government policies came in to sort of prop up banks who might have collapsed. And I'm sure you can all think of examples where governments have intervened to sort of save banks and save bad companies, save water companies that were corrupt to begin with, but would refuse to do that for its own workers, would refuse to increase minimum wage or provide any kind of like a program that would actually have support workers. And in other words, what we have seen is socialism for the rich. We see the state come to protect companies when they're going bust, so protecting the richest in our economy, so providing some kind of socialism for the rich, but capitalism for the rest of us to fight each other and to live these almost near death-like conditions in many parts of the world. So that is a countervailing tendency. We've seen it in the 80s, we've seen it in the 90s, we've seen it in the post-war boom, where government would come and invest lots of money, but a lot of the money went to businesses, and they would nationalize things as last resort as well, to basically counter the fall of some of these companies. So that's sort of one countervailing tendency, but also sort of the long-term impact of the tendency of rate of profit to fall, which is sort of concentration and monopoly capitalism. So I'll pass it back to Spencer to give a few examples, and after that we'll wrap up.
Thanks, Deena. So yeah, I'm going to go into a current example that I think helps explain the concept more and why it's relevant to us today, and that's financialization. So the biggest change that capitalism has undergone in the last 50 years is the massive shift to finance capital, or financialization. Speaking broadly, finance capital is the activity of the financial sector of the economy. It's where borrowing, lending, financial trading take place, and it also includes insurance, Bitcoin, NFTs, real estate speculation, interest payments, credit cards, like a whole host of things that are all bad. So this type of activity can be characterized in a Marxist sense as unproductive, which means that nothing of use is created from the activity. So nothing is created when someone makes money off interest, or you buy Bitcoin low and sell high. It's not like the industries that I was talking about in my previous examples, where like a product is created, a hat is created, or a car is created, something that can actually be used. Those industries are called productive industries, where labor is used to create new value. And yeah, in the last 50 years, we've seen a huge rise in non-productive financial profits. And this rise is a symptom of the fall in productive rates of profit. So as automation continues to proliferate, it has become harder and harder to raise the rate of profit through producing hats, cars, microwaves, whatever. So capitalists are increasingly turning to the financial sector to shore up the rate of profit, kind of artificially. Yeah, so here's some data from our good friends at the IMF that shows this. Yeah, just the rise in intangible investment, which kind of correlates to that non-productive financial capital that I was talking about. So this is a sign of a capitalist world in panic that is increasingly unable to create real value. And I think a closer look at the last three major financial crises also helps kind of bear this out. So in 2000, as I mentioned before, there was the dot-com crash, and this crisis was caused by the excessive speculation in the profitability of internet startups, and then the bubble popped, many internet companies went out of business, and countless people lost their jobs and savings. And then, as Deena mentioned, often happens, a couple companies, namely Google, Amazon, Nvidia, centralized and made big profits from the crisis. Next, we had the global financial crisis in 2008. And again, this crash was caused by the simultaneous falling rate of profit in productive industries like car manufacturing, and the simultaneous over-speculation and lending by banks in the real estate market. So again, we have a financial bubble that bursts and regular families lose everything. And as Deena was saying, like, the banks get bailed out, socialism for the companies to help counter the massive decline in their rates and massive profit using taxpayer money. And lastly, we have the COVID-19 recession, which, unlike these other two examples, the trigger for this crisis was not directly caused by the financial sector. The virus was the trigger. But despite this, it still fits into this pattern of increasing financialization and the inability for real value to be created to save the falling rate of profit. So during this period, we saw an explosion of increased investment in all sorts of speculation, from crypto to NFTs to real estate, and of course AI, which Deena might talk about that a bit later. So yeah, we've seen with every one of these crises, the solution is doubling down on financialization to create the next artificial boom. And this doubling down is because capitalists can't increase the rate of profit in real productive industries. Real industry continues to be increasingly automated and thus less profitable. As we've seen, capitalists are increasingly turning to speculation. So this is a sign that the system is sick, and instead of taking, the tough medicine it needs, it keeps drinking Monster energy drinks to keep itself going with all these crackpot things like AI. So maybe I'll hand it back over to Deena to talk about AI in a bit.